We are all aware of your feelings of sorrow, Doctor. Has the recess given you sufficient time to overcome the distress of your bereavement?
I doubt that there will ever be sufficient time for that, my lady.
Welcome once again to another TinDogPodcast. As promised, I'll be discussing Terror of the Vervoids this week, and as an extra, I'll also be discussing the story that's come to be known as The Ultimate Foe. The reason for this is simple. The end of this season comprises of a 4-part story, Terror of the Vervoids, and the 2-part story, The Ultimate Foe. Both of these are available in the new DVD box set, which should be out about the same time you start hearing this podcast. Also, I didn't really want to spend an entire show just talking about 2 episodes story. Together with talking about those stories, I'd like to discuss some news, but as the news is of a spoilerific nature, I'll be discussing that at the very end, after the titles, so if you don't want to hear it or don't want to hear any discussions of that nature, then just switch off after you've heard the title sequence. If not, I'll speak to you then as well. And so, onwards with Terror of the Vervoids. As you're aware from listening to my recent podcasts, this collection of stories known as Trial of the Timelords is not my favourite, mainly because of the end of Perry and the beginning of the time of Langford. Yeah, it's almost expected of old-school Doctor Who fans not to be able to cope with the fact that Bonnie Langford was brought in order to kill the series. Was brought in order to provide a star name for people to latch onto for the new companion. Comparisons were made to the hiring of Langford with the hiring of Catherine Tate, but apart from both being of the redhead variety and people having ideas about what their performances will be like, I can't really draw that many comparisons. Some people have called the time of the Langford the years of the tinnitus. Well, because of the shrill noise and the screaming, and yeah, I can see the argument for that. And if you'd rather think of it along those lines, feel free.
I'd worked with Bonnie. I did Panto with Bonnie back in the 70s. And I have never worked with anybody who is as professional as Bonnie Langford.
So ignoring the whole preconceived ideas about what Bonnie was like beforehand, the fact that she just turns up in this story without an introductory story was quite a brave move. It would logically have made more sense for the character to be introduced in an ordinary, everyday way inside the narrative of the courtroom drama that was unfolding before us. But that's just looking back. So let's talk about Terror of the Vervoids itself. If anything, this story is more of an Agatha Christie story than The Unicorn and the Wasp ever could be. It is a classic murder mystery story. Some people will get killed, the audience wonders who did it, our visiting inspector, i.e. the Doctor, solves the problem, and we move on from there. Now, I'm going to talk about the story as if you've seen it, because to be honest, you can't really discuss this story unless you've seen it. We're all aware that in this section, this is the Doctor's defence. Now, the fact that Timelord law is appalling, and you can be accused of practically anything at any time, I've already mentioned, but it is awfully odd that the Doctor's been accused of murder, interference, and a host of other things, all resulting in the possibility of having his lives removed. You're not quite sure where they're going, but you've got some sneaky suspicions. And as the Valeyard gets more and more excited, you kind of know where this is going. This is a studio-bound story, written by Pip and Jane Baker. Now, if you do buy the DVD, you can see Pip and Jane Baker defending their writing style and abilities on one of the small cutaway DVD extras. Many fans do not like the work of Pip and Jane. Some do. Some hold them in enormously high regard. I prefer to take it on a story-by-story basis. And given the things they had to deal with, this isn't truly an awful thing. We're still presented with really annoying courtroom cutaways, but on screen, the evidence that we're watching, the actual story, we are presented with a very different Sixth Doctor. To all intents and purposes, this is where the Sixth Doctor will go at some point in his life. This story must take place at some point after the trial. considering the Doctor gets off at some point, or at least hoping so. And so we're given slightly more character development, or the appearance of character development on screen. And this is where I'd like to bring in Big Finish once again. Like I said last time, Big Finish are responsible for my current view of the Sixth Doctor. The charming, witty, well thought out, well executed Doctor. The one who provides us with challenging thoughts rather than just goes through the motions. And this is the time that you start to see that. And also, as far as Big Finish is concerned, the gap between last week's story, where poor Perry bit the dust, and this week's story, where we have Mel, is where an awfully large amount of Big Finish stuff actually takes place. Inside that 7-day gap, all wonderful stories take place. The entire Evelyn saga is played out. We're not sure where Colin's time with Charlotte fits in, but that could fit in either here or after The Ultimate Foe. We have 3 basic gaps when it comes to Colin Baker's times, which are filled with Big Finish audios which really expand his character after the end of the first series of Colin, at this point, and also in between Ultimate Foe and the 7th Doctor's time. All of these have been filled marvellously, and yet I must talk about Terror of the Vervoids, a standard run-of-the-mill story where mad scientists take control of something they've created, some sort of sentient life form that, admittedly, if you pause the video in the right place, you can kind of see is made of an old tracksuit, and doesn't exactly stand up to too much scrutiny as far as Doctor Who monsters are concerned, looking to some people's eyes more than a little bit rude. And so we have the murderer and the monsters. My favourite moment of this entire story, getting back to Langford, is at the end of episode 1, where she's being shown around the bay, and the duty officer says,
"Now I'll go first. We don't want you breaking your neck. At least not until..."
So when does he want her to break her neck? I know it's probably sarcasm, but a lot of fans, including myself at the time, were thinking, until we've decided a better place for you to go? Oh, I don't know, I'm sorry, I'm fixated and I really need to move on. The Doctor all the way through this story of course says that the evidence presented on the Matrix is wrong, has been tampered with, and the Valeyard kicks off a lot. At the very end, the Doctor is accused of genocide, the ultimate crime, unless you've seen Genesis of the Daleks, where he's actively encouraged to kill her, but let's leave it there. The Vervoids, as a race, should never really have existed. They were genetically invented. So in a sense, once they did exist as seeds, they were just being killed as seeds. Oh, there's a lot of moral arguments that really don't need to be gone into at this point. And so that story drags on to an ever-depressing end. And then we are presented with Part 13 and Part 14 of the Trial of a Time Lord season.
The oldest civilization. Decadent, degenerate, and rotten to the core. Power-mech conspirators, Daleks, Sontarans, Cybermen. They're still in the nursery compared to us. 10 million years of absolute power. That's what it takes to be really corrupt.
The Ultimate Foe was written by many authors. Well, alright, 3. Robert Holmes was not a well man. Eric Sayward, the script editor, was his friend. There was a lot of backfighting, or indeed falling out, going on backstage. The production was going to suffer, and when Holmes died, having not written episode 14, Pip and Jane Baker were given episode 13, and then told, over one weekend, to write the end of the whole series, to sew up all of the ends, all of the loose ends, everything, in one episode. The episode needed to be so complicated that they actually ended up adding a whole extra 5 minutes. And even then, to this day, I still find it confusing. Yeah, there's been lots of talk about what happens, but you can't discuss it without assuming that people have seen it, or that them knowing that you're giving out spoilers. Because this whole series has been building up to one throwaway line given by the Master when he appears on the Matrix viewing screen.
They made a deal with the Valeyard, or as I've always known him, the Doctor, to adjust the evidence, in return for which he was promised the remainder of the Doctor's regenerations.
This is clear. Just a minute! Did you call him the Doctor?
There is some evil in all of us, Doctor, even you. The Valeyard is an amalgamation of the darker sides of your nature, somewhere between your 12th and final incarnation. And I may say you do not improve with age.
Most of these 2 stories take place either inside the Matrix or connected to the Matrix, and as we've discussed, that is the standard repository of all knowledge and wisdom for the Time Lords. Now, The Matrix had appeared in Doctor Who a few times, but most fans were unaware of its real existence or its real importance, and every time it had appeared it was very, very different. So here we see The Matrix as a quasi-Victorian, almost steampunk. Forgive the use of the phrase. Actually, later on I'm going to discuss more about steampunk and Doctor Who as part of this podcast. But back to Ultimate Foe. Given the basic premise now is the Doctor versus the Doctor, with the Master thrown in basically for a laugh, the audience are more than a little bit confused when we find out that he isn't definitely the Doctor. The Valiard actually is more of a potential gap between the 12th and 13th regeneration. Yes, Time Lords can only have 13 lives. Of course, in these enlightened days, and I'm sure our Doctor's going to end up with so many more than 13. My own pet theory on the whole ultimate regenerations is twofold. First, as part of the Time War, Time Lords were given the ability to regenerate an infinite amount of times thanks to the help of the Chameleon Arch. You simply become human, or another humanoid, and then you get back into the Time Lord life cycle, right back at regeneration number 1, giving you a whole new set. Yeah, let's get back to the Valiard, shall we? As stated earlier, episode 13, written by Robert Holmes, has a greatly gothic and slightly perverse feel to it. Geoffrey Hughes turns up, known to most viewers as Eddie Yates at the time from soap opera Coronation Street, but known to other people as the voice of one of the Beatles from Yellow Submarine. Eddie Yates is down as a character and is often hired for that very reason. He is a very, very good actor and pulls off the whole Victorian clerk with ideas above his station extremely well. And so as our story grinds inexorably towards its conclusion, Bonnie Langford shouts,
"A megabyte modem."
And 1,000 million computer experts go, "Oh dear." But the worst is still to come. As the story and the narrative of all 14 episodes is finally sewn up, our Doctor, our wonderful 6th Doctor, reaches the end of his time. The Colin Baker steps into the TARDIS and his last ever words are,
Carrot juice, carrot juice, carrot juice.
Admittedly, the 7th Doctor at the end of Survival is given a slightly better end sequence. But let's face it, anything that was said at the end wouldn't have been enough. It was a brave idea to sew all of the stories together, to bring them all as one narrative, but some things just weren't sorted in time. It demanded the viewer to see every single story, to pay attention much more than was normal. The backfighting, behind the scenes, and a host of other issues that really weren't the problem of the audience became to affect us. But Doctor Who did return. It had survived its hiatus. We got another 3 years, and that's alright. That's a good thing. And of course we still have Colin crashing on.
Such craftsmanship, pride in every cog and piston.
As said earlier, I have had quite a few requests to cover quite a few topics in future TinDog podcasts, all of which I'm quite pleased to do. The first thing, however, I will be covering was something mentioned in last week's TinDog podcast, when I suggested that you might want to hear some of the Clockwork Cabaret. I've had a few requests from people asking about a connection with steampunk and Doctor Who. Now that's something I'm more than pleased to discuss for, minutes. It's probably best if we start by having some sort of definition of what exactly steampunk is, which was the basis of a lot of emails. So here's the reference from Wikipedia. Steampunk is a subgenre of fantasy and sci-fi that came into prominence in the 1980s. And in the early 1990s, the term itself denotes works set in an era or world where steam power is still widely used, usually the 19th century, and often set in a Victorian-era England, but with prominent elements of either science fiction or fantasy, such as fictional technological inventors like those found in the works of H.G. Wells or Jules Verne, or real technological developments like the computer occurring at an earlier date. Other examples of steampunk contain alternate history-style presentations of the path not taken. Such technology such as airships and analog computers, these frequently are presented in an idealized light. Steampunk is often associated with cyberpunk and shares a similar fan base and the themes of rebellion, but developed as a separate movement. Both have had a considerable influence on each other, and apart from the time period and level of technological development, the main difference between cyberpunk and steampunk is that steampunk settings usually tend to be less obviously dystopian than cyberpunk, or lack that dystopian element entirely. Various modern objects have been modified by individual craftspeople into pseudo-Victorian mechanical steampunk style, and a number of visual and musical artists have been described as steampunk. Very nice description, but what does that actually mean for us? Well, for me, steampunk is a lot easier to define. It's over-engineered, something that looks kinda Victorian, kinda set in the past, and looks kinda cool. So that brings us back to Doctor Who. Can some Doctor Who stories be described as steampunk? Well, as far as I'm concerned, quite definitely. For example, the Doctor Who novel, The Doctor Trap, has a guy on the front dressed in Victorian costume, but with a ray gun, and with brass augmentation that makes him look like a brass cyborg. And to me, that is steampunk. More pertinent for me is the truly excellent Doctor Who novel, The Resurrection Casket, set in a region of space, apparently in the future, where electrical power just doesn't work. Robots have changed themselves to run on steam power, and spaceships run on solid fuel. It's a wonderful steampunk Doctor Who tale, but they are the novels. When it comes to filmed and TV stories, new Doctor Who has some lovely moments. The two most obvious examples, of course, are the clockwork androids from The Girl in the Fireplace, and to a certain lesser extent, Tooth and Claw, with its spurious use of technology to take on the werewolves. There are some steampunk stories that have vampires, werewolves and ghosts and the like, based or more influenced by the works of H.P. Lovecraft and a host of other writers from the 20s. So apart from New Who and its lovely references, what else can we be offered? Well, in a time travel programme, it's quite easy to visit the past, and when aliens have got technology that shouldn't really belong in the past, all bets are off when it comes to steampunk influences. But because the term itself only really comes into play in the 80s, the very, very late 80s, almost a time when Doctor Who had gone, we have to just look at examples of the story that now fit into that category. Going backwards, we'll make our first stop at the story I'll be covering in a few weeks' time when I review one of the old DVD releases that you may already have, which is Ghostlight. Ghostlight has futuristic technology in a Victorian setting. Stone spaceships are just the beginning of that steampunk ethos. And it is also worthy of note that Ghostlight itself was heavily influenced by the Gormenghast stories, and again they have influenced the whole feel of the steampunk literary movement. Going slightly further back, our next best bet for steampunk in Doctor Who is without question the 8th Doctor's design for his interior of the TARDIS. It's wood, it doesn't match, it's futuristic, and it belongs in the past. It's a wonderful mismatch of design and a host of other things. If you had to illustrate steampunk to anyone, that would be a great starting point. Further back we end up with stories that are basically set in one time period but have the technology of others, Talons of Wen Chiang, even City of Death, Evil of the Daleks, using mirrors and static electricity to travel through time. All of these things have wonderful bits of technology which don't belong. Not quite steampunk is the story Battlefield, which could be described more as a fantasy tale reworked. And like all Doctor Who, it relies on earlier bits of fiction. And the prototype for most steampunk stories is H.G. Wells' Time Machine, which of course gave birth eventually to Doctor Who as a thought. If you want to see other examples of steampunk in action, unfortunately a very good example of a good idea badly executed is the film Wild Wild West. Yes, if you've seen it, I am sorry, and I'm not recommending you do. It has some lovely designs, some lovely thoughts, but just doesn't quite work. The anime film Steam Boy is well worth digging out, and to a lesser, more comical extent, of course, Young Einstein. Doctor Who itself is never truly steampunk, but it does have flashes of marvellous inspiration, and all of that from talking about The Clockwork Cabaret. After the end credits, I'd like to discuss something of a spoiler, so if you don't want to hear any spoilers, be seeing you, and if you do, I'll speak to you after the credits. You have been listening to the TinDogPodcast. Doctor Who and its associated shows are all trademark of the BBC. No infringement is intended. Contact us at tin-dog@hotmail.co.uk. Thanks for sticking with me. You probably already know what I want to talk about. Various sources of late have had two pieces of news The first is the possibility that Paul McGann, the Eighth Doctor, could be making a short appearance as a flashback or even a multi-Doctor story at some point in next year's specials. If it's true, this is a marvellous thing. Some reports say that he'll have his hair shorn short rather than having the floppy wig. But in all fairness, I've seen Paul use his own hair at a convention, and as long as he lets it grow for a month or so, it would look close enough to the original wig to fool most people. The real question for me is, if Paul McGann's Doctor does turn up, will he have a companion? Will we finally get to see Charlotte, or even Lucy on screen? I suspect, as Sheridan Smith is a slightly bigger name, we're more likely to see Lucy in action, and this of course would give more credibility to the BBC 7 audios made by Big Finish, which I think are on later this year. These same audios have already been available on CD. The second piece of news is something that's been taken completely out of context. In Russell T Davies's memoirs, the story of him being a writer on Doctor Who, which I believe comes out very early in October. In the excerpts, Russell says that it would be ideal if a certain actor takes on the role of the 11th Doctor, because he's going to be a huge actor. I personally think this has been taken more than a little bit out of context. Saying that someone's a great actor and saying that they would make an ideal Doctor really doesn't mean that they're going to be cast, especially if the source of this is a man who isn't really going to be in charge when the casting decisions are being made. But hey, I'm sure these things will all come to a head shortly when we get an official announcement as to whether David Tennant is staying or going. Like I said, thanks for hanging back and hearing to me rant and ramble. Be seeing you.
It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known.